Good evening and welcome to a community conversation on democracy. This event is made possible by a mini grant through the Warner Library by Humanities New York, whose mission is, and I quote, to strengthen civil society and the bonds of community using the humanities to foster engaged inquiry and dialogue around social and cultural concerns. That's quite a mouthful. My name is Barrett Seaman, and I am the chairman of the editorial board of the Hudson Independent newspaper. We're pleased to partner with Warner and our good friend Maureen Petrie. Maureen, you here? Who anybody who lives in this town knows runs the show here. Democracy is a big, sprawling topic that has been hanging around for some 2,600 years. It roughly translates from the Greek to the strength of the common people. But how and whether a society embraces it and is committed to it is a question with many, many subsets, only some of which our panel will be able to touch upon tonight. There are different versions of democracy. Ours is a representative democracy, what we call a republic. At the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, as Benjamin Franklin was leaving, a woman called out to him and said, "Well, doctor, what have you got for us, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Can we keep it? How do we keep it? Are there other systems that might be better today? In 1947, Winston Churchill quipped, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that we've tried from time to time. The British have a parliamentary government, a constitutional monarchy, as do several other European states. There are social democracies, notably in the Scandinavian countries. Israel has a parliamentary democracy, but it also calls itself a Jewish state. Are the two compatible? Iran's government has the surface trappings of a parliamentary democracy, but under the control of an Islamic theocracy. There are sham democracies like China's one-party, i.e. communist system. That's true of North Korea, the so-called People's Democratic Republic. The Russian Duma is pretty much a rubber stamp for Vladimir Putin, who controls the body through intimidation, blackmail, cronyism, occasionally murder. Then there's Venezuela. I don't know what we do with that these days. There are many questions that arise when we examine democracy. What are the essentials that make it work? Voter education and participation, how important are they? A free press, what role does that play? Economic freedom. Is democracy compatible with socialism? Is it inextricably limited or linked to capitalism? What are its great threats today? Tribalism, political polarization, voter manipulation, misinformation, like fake news, gerrymandering, voter suppression. These are all issues, and I hope we're going to touch upon them tonight. Our panelists are going to touch on these, at least some of these, but I'm going to leave it to them to speak for themselves. But I would like to introduce them. To my immediate left is Rick Rose, who is Tarrytown's historian and past president of the Historical Society. He has taught in both high school and college over 45 years and continues to teach in the Collegium program of Westchester Community College. He has degrees from the University of Buffalo and the University of Maryland. Next down the line is Richard Hoffman, who has taught American history, government, and economics at Dobbs Ferry High School for 27 years. Some 2,000 Dobbs Ferry students have taken his classes. He also runs the school's voter registration drive and is coordinator of the senior internship program. He holds an AB degree from Harvard and a master's from Indiana University. Matthew Ives, on the far left there, has taught European and world history at the master's school for 22 years. He was head of the upper school for 5 years as well. He has his undergraduate degree from Catholic University of America in Washington and a master's in history from the University of Maryland. Going over on this side, Christopher Loomis teaches U.S. and world history courses in the upper schools to the upper school students at Hackley. Chris earned his BA in history from Harvard, where he earned a Thomas T. Hoops Prize for the strength of his undergraduate thesis. He earned his MA from the University of Virginia and continued his work on his dissertation, or still continue to do your work on it. As a graduate student at UVA, he served as a teaching assistant for classes including American history. Next is Jessica Hunsberger, who has taught social studies at Sleepy Hollow High School for 24 years and currently chairs the department. For 20 of those years, she has taught AP Government and Politics. She was a political science major at Colgate University, where she participated in the Semester in Washington program. And at the far end of the table to the right is Isabella Calix, our one senior at Sleepy Hollow High School. Isabella is an active member of the Rho Kappa, the National Social Studies Honor Society, and according to the department chair, who's I think sitting next to her, she is an outstanding student in the AP Government and Politics class. She will be attending Smith College in the fall. So we'll start out with Rick Rose and the topics. We have a rough idea of what we're going to be saying tonight, but I'm sure there's going to be some overlap, and where there isn't, I expect you all to fill in the gaps.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and participate in this august event. My area of inquiry tonight is voter registration, which could raise the eyebrows of many people these days, as we see that voter registration has become a more controversial issue. I think we should realize that voter registration is the way in which the individual gets an opportunity to participate in a representative democracy. Of course, it's a screening process, and we've had this screening process of who can vote for a very, very long time. If we go back to the original days and remember the early days of the Republic, property qualifications were mandatory for people to vote. So if you were not a wealthier person in the community, your ability to vote was not present. You didn't participate. So the democracy was a very limited democracy. Of course, the Founding Fathers saw in their wisdom the need not to legislate who could vote, but to leave that entirely up to every state. And we have the same plan today, except for a few general changes that have come in through amendments by the federal government. So every state gets an opportunity to determine its own qualifications for a voter. And believe me, they do vary, and the more I have looked at it, the more they seem to vary. Naturally, you've got to be a citizen of the United States, and you need to be a resident of the state in which you are voting in order to participate. But for a very long time, our only voters in this country were adult white males. That does not speak well for a democracy, but we have to realize our democracy was beginning. It was a growing democracy, and I can show you a little bit along the way how we did expand it as we made voter registration a more positive experience for more people. You might remember that after the Civil War, there were 3 amendments. These 3 amendments ultimately allowed blacks the right to vote. We do know that during Reconstruction, blacks in the South did vote. However, we know that that lasted but for a short time. When Reconstruction was over, states established all kinds of voter restrictions. Among them, you might remember learning about literacy tests, and the poll tax, and the grandfather clause, all of which made sure that African Americans who were newly freed were not going to have the right to vote in southern states. We don't find very many of them voting in northern states either. Women's suffrage was always a question. And of course, women pushed hard, and ultimately, starting in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, were able to push the idea through to some states in an early phase. Right after the Civil War, Colorado, one of the first states to allow women the right to vote. Certainly a leader, but the rest of the country didn't follow suit until after World War I and the passage of an amendment. And then we have a long break before we do much else as far as improving situations for voter registration. The civil rights legislation helped get minorities and African Americans into a voting pattern. However, the registration process was still very, very difficult. You might remember the Freedom Riders and all the difficulties they had in trying to get people registered so that they would have the right to vote. We did, however, with the help of the federal government, get to the age of 18 as the voting qualification for all men and women, and all states had to abide by it. Prior to that, we had scattered ages from 21 down to 18 who could vote. Now, at least, we were at a common age requirement. Voter registration rules are difficult because there are always limitations that are put in there. The registration requires that someone must register to vote at least 30 days before the election occurs. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do unless you have been a resident of your community for a long time. If you are a new arrival, you might have difficulty getting that registration in time for the election, and obviously, if you don't have the registration completed, you are not going to vote. Some states have expanded registration, which I think is important for us to understand. And New York has been involved in that with mail-in registrations, in-person registrations, as well as online registration. However, that doesn't cut it for everybody because it's still difficult for many people to get to registration. It's hard for them to accomplish it. The online registration, people think, is the answer to all of our prayers. I don't think it is because many minority groups don't have an access or the skill or the knowledge in order to be able to process that unless they can get to maybe a library where someone could show them how to do it. So it creates some issues. There are some states which have same-day voter registration. New York is not one of them. We can register prior to, you need to register 30 days beforehand if you want to be able to participate in the election in New York. Some states also have pre-registration. In New York, you can register. Many of us who are high school department heads organize registration drives for our students, our graduating seniors, and have them pre-register so that they would be able to participate in the upcoming election. The registration has many issues that we ought to mention at least a few. One is the identification process. In many states, you need a photo ID in order to register to vote. In some states, you also need to produce that same photo ID in order to vote when you appear at the polls. That is not true in New York. You don't have to prove who you are. You just have to show that you are registered and they find your name. However, the photo ID is another difficulty for people who live in poor communities because many of them do not drive cars. Driver registration offices are not usually located in those neighborhoods, and so it's oftentimes difficult for them to get it. And of course, the new ID, the new driver license IDs, you can't tamper with. They're tamper-proof, and those are the only ones that people are accepting. So it creates some frustrations. We still have problems with our registration in America, and we raise issues on how should we resolve them. One problem of voter registration involves felons. Should a convicted felon have his voting rights restored? Should he be able to register while he's in prison? When he returns into the main society, should he be able to register then? Some states are allowing all of that to happen. New York is not one of those states. So voter registration continues to be a problem in our country. It keeps us from becoming the complete democracy that we could be. And hopefully we will have some changes that will be occurring. Albany has already initiated some legislation and we have some movement forward. And that's a good sign for New York. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like you all to imagine that it's a Saturday night and you're out at your favorite restaurant having a nice dinner, And the waiter approaches your table, hands you a menu, and says, the people over at table 6 are going to be choosing 2 dishes from this menu, and you are limited to those 2. You can only order those 2 dishes, and they're not picking up the check, you are. And I imagine that most of us would not find that to be a particularly optimal way to spend a Saturday night, especially if it's your favorite restaurant and you know what you want. That analogy is how the system for nominating candidates for president, I think, looks to many Americans. And I have a few statistics, most courtesy of the Pew Research Foundation, which does extensive polling on matters related to American elections. 3 out of 4 eligible voters did not participate in the nominating process in 2016. That is 3 out of 4, well, really it's 29 out of 40 if you want to be mathematically precise. 3 out of 4 did not participate in the process of choosing who either the Democratic or Republican candidate for president would be. And what's most notable, I think, and what's astonishing about this number is that this is actually the second highest level of participation in the nomination process since Pew started measuring this in 1980. Only in 2008, the Obama-McCain election, was there greater participation in the nomination process. And there, it was a little over 30% of Americans participated. That still means that 7 out of 10 Americans are not participating in the nomination process. And I think there's lots of intelligent conjecture and overlapping reasons for why that might be. I think we can make many educated guesses. Many people are simply not familiar with the process. Many people don't identify with either of the 2 major political parties. I think about a third of Americans today define themselves as independent. Some people live in a state where the participation in the process comes at the very end of that process, and therefore they may feel, why bother? It's already a foreordained conclusion. And we see how more and more states are front-loading their primaries and trying to leapfrog over one another. California, I believe, this year is going to be holding a primary in either late February or early March. They used to be in June. It may be that some people think of the process as being rigged, so why bother? 32% of Democrats and 45% of Republicans in 2016 said that they had a lack of confidence in the primary system or the way we do things as being the most effective way to choose a candidate. And I think there's also there's a disconnect between the lever that you pull. Well, we don't pull levers anymore, but the circle you bubble in. And the actual nominee, that it isn't always a straight line. And I think a lot of people don't understand the process or see the process. And so even if it isn't rigged, it's certainly easy to think that it is. Anyone who wishes to influence the outcome or wants to reform the process needs to know how it works. And as a high school teacher, I see this as a major teaching priority for my students, particularly with the 2020 election coming up. Starting in February of 2020 and going through June, all 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus 5 overseas territories, plus a group of Americans living overseas called Democrats Abroad. All of those entities will conduct some sort of nominating event during that time period. And if you do the math, For some reason, there's no comparable Republicans abroad group, but that works out to 113 different nominating events that will take place between February and June of next year. And it's actually a little bit more than that because, believe it or not, some states do it more than once. Iowa has a multi-stage process. Alaska has a multi-stage process. And so, you know, you're close to 120 different events. Now, each individual can only participate in one of those events. But what they all have in common is they're designed to choose people we call delegates who will go to one of the major party nominating conventions in the summer, and they will then, at those conventions, choose the nominee of the party. And leapfrogging on, or picking up on the voter registration issue, every state has different rules. Some states, and the whole system, by the way, is not constitutionally mandated. There's nothing in the Constitution about the process for nominating the president. There's nothing in the Constitution about political parties. There's even very little in federal law about it other than campaign finance law. The process has evolved into kind of a Rube Goldberg operation, for those of you who know that reference. That is a mixture of state law and political party rules. And as a result, you have some states in which you can only vote in the primary election if you are a member of a political party. If you register in New York, you can't vote in the Democratic primary if you're not registered as a Democrat. You can't vote in the Republican primary if you're not registered as a Republican. And one of the things I tell my students is you can choose to identify as independent, but registering as an independent removes you from that process, the way it happens. And New York makes it even more complicated because there actually is a political party in New York called the Independence Party, which is not the same as being an independent. That's something that sometimes confuses students when they check the party affiliation box. New York does it one way, other states do it similarly, but then there are other states that say, no, you can decide on the day of the election which party primary you want to vote in. There are even a few states where one party says you can do that, but the other party says, no, you're not welcome unless you're one of us. They hold primary elections. Primary election is simply a, drop by, vote, and leave type of election, or mail it in. 9 states still hold caucuses, which are a 19th century innovation, or maybe earlier, in which people actually gather in rooms like this, and they vote what's called viva voce in front of everyone. All in favor of candidate A, raise your hand. All in favor of candidate B, raise your hand. And so you're voting in public. And that's a process that involves several hours of someone's time. Now, you can't just drive by, vote, and leave. And then the process is even more complicated in that they don't all have to think the same. Certainly, intelligent minds can debate the value of the system, but as far as students are concerned, I think knowing this process and being familiar with this process is the first step before you can even begin to decide how do I change it, how do I fix it.
Democracies have a tendency to vote themselves out of existence. And that's something that it's an oxymoron. I don't know exactly how to resolve that. But the example of France, for example, twice in the 1800s they voted for emperor. In 1848, France, which was the first a real election that had universal male suffrage, and there were no restrictions based upon income. Overwhelmingly, the monarchists and the Bonapartists won. So you had a massive turnout. Lots and lots of people in France voted, but they voted against the democracy. And that led to a situation where the people on the left, the people who saw themselves as supporters of the Republic, found themselves very confused because they were strong supporters of democracy, but they were really upset with the voters themselves. And Karl Marx famously, in response to that election, called the voters in France sacks of potatoes. And I think we see that today too. I think that on the left in particular right now, there's frustration with American voters. There was a book a number of years ago out called What's the Matter with Kansas? And the premise was, okay, the voters are just stupid. They're voting against their own interest. And I don't know, I'm not really, maybe we can talk about how to reconcile that. My research was about how France became democratic, and one of the themes was that there was an immature electorate. This is something that you see that, voters just aren't ready for democracy. They haven't yet been educated. And I sort of drifted away from that idea. I don't think that electorates are immature. They're not ready for democracy. I just think that there's nothing that voters don't necessarily inherently see the value in democracy. When they're making their choices about how they want to vote, they're much more interested, I think, in practical concerns about their standards of living. They do want freedoms, and I think in an ideal world, when things are going well, they tend to choose democracy, but not always. I think probably the most recent time that we're probably more familiar with would be the 1930s, faced with the Great Depression in both not only the United States but in Europe. Many people turned away from democracy because it wasn't working, quite honestly. The democratic systems that were established in Europe after World War I were parliamentary. They tended to have, they're not all the same depending on where you were in Europe, but they weren't two-party systems, and they fell into gridlock. And you had a situation where in some places 75% of the populace was out of work and the government wasn't doing anything. And in that context, democracy didn't seem like a very attractive choice. And I'm not going to read, I have a long quote here from Mussolini criticizing democracy. That wouldn't be surprising to you, but I was reading the other week, and I was really struck by this quote, which is from an American. And I'll finish with this, and the quote is, "Benevolent despotism has greater possibilities for good than democracy." And then this person went on to propose that the United States, too, travel, quote, along the road which leads through constitutional change to the authoritarian state. And that was George Kennan in the 1930s, who was he constructed the containment, and I actually don't know all that much about him. Actually, Chris probably knows more about him than I do. But anyway, so I guess the point is that I personally, I think that's a real danger right now, that there is a tendency for voters in the face of emergencies, either real or imagined, to turn towards authoritarianism and vote for authoritarian figures.
I think we want Chris a chance to respond to that right now. You don't have to respond.
I don't know, I maybe you don't.
Isn't there a new biography of Kennan out? I think one of the major points is that he spent his whole life talking about democracy and defending democracy against communism, but in his personal life was deeply skeptical and contemptuous of democracy.
I think there's a lot of people like that.
Could you speak up a little? Yeah.
Sure. So my task tonight is to talk about the internet and democracy, and I'm going to try to do something that we have a difficult time doing on the internet, which is to speak reasonably. And before I start, I just want to point out a couple of tendencies that we have in thinking about the relationship between technology and democracy. The first is just what I mentioned before, to speak in extremes. We seem to be, as a society, incapable of talking about the impact of technology and democracy in anything other than utopian and dystopian terms. And the internet didn't invent this. If you go back to the 1920s, you see people talking about the potentially transformative or catastrophic effects of radio. Ditto the late 1940s and 1950s when you see public discourse on TV. And the second one is a tendency, and I think a mistake, to talk about technology within a deterministic framework. In other words, the internet does this to us. And I don't want to dismiss the disruptive and unintended consequences of innovation, but I also think it's useful to remember in these discussions that humans create technologies and shape them to their own ends. So I think it's important for us to remember our own agency at all times when we think about how technology is going to reshape the democratic system. So one of the coolest things that I get to do at Hackney School is to teach an elective course on media history and culture. And that's a course that I usually get juniors and seniors in. So I spend the years sort of tormenting them with difficult questions on just this issue, on the relationship between technology and media and democracy. So I'm going to use my privilege with the mic here tonight to put some of the same questions that I asked them to you and let you guys grapple with that. So I want to just kind of introduce three sort of areas of discussion that we might seek to pursue in a little bit more depth. The first has to do with public discourse. So what the internet means in the most basic fundamental terms is that we get more information a lot faster, sometimes even instantaneously. And so my question on that is, how can we put that technology, the internet, towards creating a more substantive and inclusive discourse that gets citizens the information they need? I think is something you're also going to add on to. And I like to, when I torment my students, some of us call it teaching, I like to sort of get them to think about this as sort of two sides of a coin. So to start with the sort of catastrophic side of that, what we've seen with the internet is its role in accelerating the decline of traditional journalistic institutions, even the Gray Lady down in Midtown Manhattan. We've seen the rise of extremism in discourse in sort of dark shadows or dark corners of the internet. And on the other side, we've seen the rise of citizen journalism and sort of an expansion in the range of discourse that often historically did not get covered in traditional print newspapers or even on TV. And we've also seen, along with that, the empowerment of new communities. I think it's difficult to imagine something like Me Too without social media. And also avenues for dissent opening up. And I think this is especially important when we look outside the American perspective and think about events like the Arab Spring. And the other thing is that we can think of the internet as sort of the culmination of a long-standing historical tendency, which is the push towards instantaneity, trying to get information a lot faster. And most of us assume that's a really cool thing. And I tend to take a much more cautious view of that. I think my wife and I just spent a week in New Zealand, and I think the tragedy and horror of Christchurch should be a cautionary tale as we think about the virtues and costs of live information. The second thing I want us to think about is community and how the internet can reshape that. So how can we use the internet to create a stronger sense of community? And so when I think about community, I think of it as kind of the glue that holds us together. And I think the internet provides, at least potentially, a couple things that are necessary to that. One is space to debate and the opportunity to talk to one another. And again, when I talk to my students, I like to get them to think about some competing values there. So on one hand, we have this question of civility. When we're in a public space and we're speaking to each other, it turns out it's more productive when we're nice to one another. So this seems to be very challenging when we get to the internet. So when we think about sort of how we occupy that space online, I think my students in particular have a great deal of skepticism towards anonymity and privacy on the internet. And I'd just like to push back on that a little bit and get us to think carefully about the value of anonymity and the kinds of communities who might not be able to exist in a public space without that kind of shield. So I think they both have value. And the last issue I want us to think about is, I think, the most controversial, and that's, simply put, power. Who should control communications technologies like the internet? One of the things that makes American media truly exceptional, when you look at kind of the global context, is the extent to which American media developed in private hands. American media is the most thoroughgoing social media in the world, as far as I know. And for the most part, in our public discourse, we've assumed that's a super good thing. The idea there basically being that the market will facilitate a free and wide-ranging exchange of ideas. And sometimes that works, and sometimes less so. All you have to do is read the Times and its coverage of Facebook and the various regulatory investigations going on there to be skeptical of the virtue and public purpose of some of the folks who are in charge of major social media corporations. Right? Facebook has about 2.2 billion users, I think at last count. And we should remember the guy in charge of Facebook got his start on the internet with a site that asked Harvard undergraduates to compare the relative attractiveness of their classmates. So, and this is the guy who's in charge of large social network.
Thanks for right here in our institute.
And when we think about power, I think we should also think about government. And when we think about government in relation to media, we usually think of scary things like surveillance and the constriction of free speech, and surely those are issues. Also want us to think about the potentially positive effect of regulation, and something that really hasn't come to fruition on the internet that we did see develop with radio and television, which is the emergence of a vital and robust public media system.
So we go last because I think we've got the answers to everything everybody's been talking about. And I know we have a lot of teachers in the room and we have students in the room, and so to me the answer is public education. And that first word might be a little controversial on this panel too, so I don't know if we'll get into that. But I was thinking about the history of the relationship between democracy and education. And it's interesting because actually George Washington in his farewell address, we always talk about neutrality and warnings against political parties, but he actually mentioned education in his farewell address. And he did say that, I'm going to go back and forth with my glasses here. He did say that he advocated for public schools that would teach students to value their own rights and to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority. Thomas Jefferson talked about education. There was the Common Schools movement in the early 1800s, and then of course Horace Mann is considered to be the father of the beginning of real public education. But I think what I wanted to talk about today is, it's interesting, lately there's actually been debate about democracy versus republic in states across the country. And so what is democracy? So, you know, we started tonight and we said that representative democracy, we have a republic. And what does that mean? Because the way we define it also influences how we teach students to participate in it or to comply with it, right? So are we only teaching students these days, you know, there are schools of thought that we need to teach students to know their rights, understand the Constitution, know the process, the burdens on the individual for registering to vote. So I can teach you how to register to vote. I can register you to vote, right? I can teach you about the primary process or the caucus system and the flaws with it. But when I was doing some reading, an old classmate of mine who is a professor of educational leadership, she came up with a new term which is called deep democracy. And the definition for deep democracy is, she talked about that schools have an important civic role in cultivating in students the habits and dispositions of citizenship, including how to access information, determine the veracity of claims, think critically, research problems, ask questions, collaborate with others, communicate ideas, and act to improve the world. So that's a much bigger definition of democracy than what we traditionally say. And so what does that look like? And so I did some thinking about that. And what does that look like in our curriculum? It means that we have an active curriculum that is inquiry-based and student-centered, where they're asking the questions, they're making the discoveries, and a lot of us, we know that and we do that. For pedagogy, it means that it's about problem solving, and for the organization of school structures, we need to have systems in place where students are developing habits of responsibility and social engagement. So I think that's the key. I'm at Sleepy Hollow, where we have clubs and we have our Great Honor Society that's here tonight, and we teach students how to be leaders, and we challenge them to want to ask the questions. We challenge them to look at social media and the internet and question those sources and where those things are coming from. And I think that that's the way that we will revitalize. And of course, we're always waiting for the youth, the 18 to 29-year-olds, to be the turnout change. And they really are the ones that when they really come out and vote the way they should be, we can see some of those changes. And in recent elections, I think we have seen more of that. So, what it's not, I shouldn't have put this as my last thing, but what it's not is it's not about standardized testing, and that's the interesting part of the role that government has played, and finally Cuomo made a change in his budget, right, and he decoupled standardized testing from teacher evaluations. It was kind of, it was done. When he did it, it was a big thing, and when he undid it, it was a very quiet thing because it was a big mistake. But testing started when I was studying this, and I have to say I was a poli-sci major who, after being in DC, decided to go into education, thinking that was the way to revitalize democracy. And I wish Tom Avenanti was here tonight, because, and you can tell him it was Jacobs that I said this, but it's frustrating working in government. So I felt a lot more energized being able to empower and make change through the public school system. So the first thing I studied was The Nation at Risk in 1986, was when the national government was saying, wow, our schools are in trouble and what do we do? Well, what did they focus on? They brought us to this idea of testing, and it's about math, and it's about science, and that brought us to NCLB and Race to the Top, where there's a lot of standardized testing. And what has that done? It's taken the focus and the resources away from civics, from citizenship, from social studies, from studying the world and global understandings. So that's where the concern is for me today, but this is what, the mission has been for all of these years.
I think the one thing that has stayed constant is the need for education, and that has always been there. And I actually have a statistic that from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization that states that 1 in every 5 children, adolescents, and youth are out of school. And I think that brings context to the fact that in the U.S. has always put education and always guaranteed it, regardless of race and ethnicity. And additionally, I think that, especially in your class with Hunsberger and AP Government, you have taught us that with every issue and every conflict we come across, that you have trained us to step back and say, what does this tell us about our government and about our democracy? And I think that's really going to help the new generation of students evaluate problems and problem solve and solve the problems that this panel has been talking about. And I have a quote here that I think sums up the goal for students and the future of education. It's from Cesar Chavez, a Mexican-American farm worker, labor leader, and civil rights activist. And the quote is, "Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours."
Thank you. I thought it might be a good exercise, and now that we've gone through this, is for each of us here on the panel and then maybe in the audience itself to concentrate on one particular thing that you would fix if you have the opportunity. And since I have the mic, I'll start. What I would fix first in our system is what we call gerrymandering. The process of politicizing who gets to vote in what districts, congressional districts in particular. And it's been politicized for a long time, and there were people who will defend it as legitimately a political exercise. That is, the ruling party in a state gets to decide what the shape of the districts is and who is in it. What has happened, though, in my view, is a complete distortion of the democratic process by creating these artificial districts, some of which look like long, filigree snakes, other things. Here in New York, we have one district that goes across the Throgs Neck Bridge from Queens into the Bronx. I personally believe that what we ought to have is a system where we have non-political decisions based on population basis and let the chips fall where they may in terms of whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents in those particular districts. But I think you're likely to get away from, or at least minimize the amount of totally partisan districting where, take the case of North Carolina, where you have a vast majority of people who voted one way, and yet the representation of the state and the state legislature is completely lopsided the other, almost exclusively because of gerrymandering. So that's my fix, but we can, yes you may.
I have to pass it to him.
What do you think?
I wanted to give my own fix.
Okay.
And I didn't want to talk about gerrymandering because I thought you did a great job. All right? But my fix would be back to voter registration. I think people ought to be able to walk into an election station and be able to vote that same day. So same day registration would be the way in which we could fix it, so a lot more people would vote. And maybe if a lot more people voted, things would be a little different than they currently are in many places around the country. I fell upon this stat even though it's a little old. In 2010, in our own state, 47% of the people between the ages of 18 and 24, our new youth, right, were registered. 47%. That's not good. They're not registered, they're not voting. So over half of the people in that age group didn't even bother to register or found registration too difficult. So same day registration, I'm for it. Thank you.
You're on, Rick.
I agree, we need to fix gerrymandering, but I actually think we need to go further. Our House of Representatives is organized on a district system. That is, every state that has more than one representative must divide itself into regional districts. And then in each district there is a representative who is sent to Washington. The House of Representatives is a winner-take-all system. So whichever party wins the majority of those districts is in complete control. Every congressional committee is controlled by that party, and if you compare with, say, other legislatures in other industrial democracies, there's more of a proportional system in play. So a party that has won 35% of the seats might end up with 35% of the power, or maybe not 35%, but and I think we need to experiment with different ways of organizing our legislature. One suggestion that was made years ago is to actually allow the districts, this is called cumulative voting. So, and when for about a decade when I was teaching in Dobbs Ferry, the boundary line between, because of gerrymandering, the boundary line between the 17th and 18th congressional district ran right down Broadway. And if you lived in Dobbs Ferry and you were on the opposite side of Broadway, you were in one congressional district. And if you lived on the riverside, you were in a different congressional district. And I actually learned this after marking a bunch of students' papers incorrectly when I asked, who's your congressperson? And they said, my congressperson is Elliot Engel. My parents voted for Elliot Engel. I said, no, it's not. It's Neil Lowe. You were in the, And then I went and actually looked up the district map, and I saw right smack down Broadway. Cumulative voting actually allows for the combination of districts into much larger districts, or a way that states could actually virtually reorganize themselves.
Yeah, more people voting is great, but I want to make sure the people that are going to vote are doing it the right way. And so I don't want to say too much about it, but I think it's really, really important that we teach critical thinking skills so that when you're going out and making a decision about an issue or about a candidate, you can maybe figure out what the truth is or what your truth is in a way that you're not being led by the nose, which is what it means to be a demagogue. It means to lead people by the nose. And so you're less likely to fall victim to that. And I think talking about the internet and civil discourse, I think we need to model civil discourse in our classrooms and not be afraid of talking about tough issues, because one of the things that's a challenge for me as a teacher is the sort of feeling that I need to not let my feelings be known, and that maybe there are certain topics that we need to shy away from in class because we worry about kids being offended. And I think those are real concerns. But I think that there are ways that you can have real conversations about very, very controversial topics that don't devolve into people screaming at each other and making personal accusations. And we, as the adults in the room, need to model that for our students. And those are the two things that I would like to say.
Back to this side.
So I think if I could wave a wand and fix something about democracy, I think I would reverse the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby versus Holder. The decision during the Obama administration, which vacated the key enforcement sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was designed to secure the promise of the 15th Amendment and guarantee African Americans the right to vote. First of all, I just think that decision is a poor reading of history and a poor reading of the Constitution. The first clause of the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote shall not be removed on the basis of race or condition of previous servitude. And the second clause, which I think the Supreme Court forgot to read, was that Congress shall be empowered to enforce that provision with appropriate legislation, which I happen to think the Voting Rights Act was. We've spent a lot of time and money investigating allegations of voter fraud in my lifetime, and for all of those resources we've spent, we've found precious little evidence of it. So the solutions, so to speak, aimed at curbing voter fraud are in fact solutions in search of a problem. And I think in that sense it's appropriate simply to call them racist. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. The first is simply that we should all be concerned about the fundamental political rights and liberties of all of our citizens. I think that's essential to a healthy, functioning democracy, and to, frankly, securing the legacy of the civil rights movement and the Civil War. The second piece has to do with what it takes to kind of sustain a healthy, functioning democracy. You need to have free and fair elections, and you need to have both the winners and the losers in those elections accept the legitimacy of those outcomes. So, for example, I don't know if Stacey Abrams would have won the governorship of Georgia in the last election cycle had all of the people in Georgia who had the right to vote been allowed to vote. What I don't believe is that Brian Kemp was a legitimate governor of Georgia because of the tactics that he used in trying to disfranchise voters in that state. And I speak as someone who used to live in Georgia and voted there. So I think that this is not just about African American political rights. I think this is about the broader health of our democracy as a whole.
I think my vote in terms of changing something in our political world, it would have been gerrymandering as well. And the Supreme Court has an opportunity to make a decision there, and they're afraid to do that. And so that's, That's an interesting one. But then I think I still go back to public education, and I think that we need to fund pre-K before we fund college, to be honest with you. Because those of us who have been in the classroom for a long time, we know that these gaps that exist happen way before high school. And so funding pre-K and valuing teachers and education so that we can get those who are really the best and the brightest and the most motivated would be an excellent start.
If I could fix one issue, I would also say education. My mom is actually a teacher and she works in Yonkers, and I see that if they did have more funding, how much more they could do. So that's definitely something I would fix too.
I think this would be a good time to open it up to questions from you folks out there. We're running a little late on time. We have a microphone up here.
How many of the times you've gone to the poll and you've had Hobson's choice rather than the choice you wanted? Do we have the candidates that we want? And I'm going to be with the Chinese at the moment. I think the main problem in this country is that we, the public, accept corruption, not just of government, but of all commerce. And in doing so, we will accept whatever. And if we don't clean up what we think is wrong in the very basics of our society, then we can't expect the government to be functioning to the standards we would like. Thank you.
Simple question, what, for several of you to answer about abolishing the Electoral College, what your opinion is.
I think there are some very clear and obvious reasons why the Electoral College has failed us in two of the past 5 elections. The popular vote winner has lost the election. I've always taught my students to look at both sides of this issue. There are certainly advantages to the Electoral College. It forces and encourages candidates to campaign in places they would never ever go. If we had a pure popular vote election, if you were running for president, you would dump all your money on campaigns you'd buy all the television time in New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, Miami, and you would never ever be in Wyoming or Iowa or any of those other Kansas. The problem, I think, with the way the Electoral College has and again, it's evolved. It's not. It doesn't work the way it was originally intended to work, and it's been just growing. Little pieces keep getting added on over time, and so it doesn't treat all states fairly. And I don't know how to do that. I don't. Until very recently, I thought maybe there was some way to modify the Electoral College to make it work, but I think maybe its time has gone, and we need to reevaluate.
With the Electoral College has been working for 250 years, and it gives the people, rural America, a chance to vote, whereas the large cities would dominate the voting process, and the people out in Kansas would have no say. But anyway, my real beef tonight is with Mr. Rose, with his voting. I think that an American citizen has the right to vote, and I think that only an American citizen has the right to vote. I don't believe illegal immigrants have the right to vote, and they've been encouraged to vote by politicians. You only have to look at the last election. And as far as voter ID, you can't go to the bank today and cash a $100 bill unless you prove who you are. I think there should be voter ID. he or she has to be an American citizen, has to be of a certain age, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, I think the thing is going to collapse. It's almost to the point where I think we need to drill a hole in the middle of this politicians, fill it up and start over again. That's how bad I think it's got. And I think also, which you didn't hit upon, is term limits. The president is only good for 8 years. You get a guy elected to the Congress or Senate for 30 years, he owns that seat, basically. So we should have term limits, which they will never do. But that's what should be done. And I think all the problems that you mentioned are correct. And all the problems were created by elected officials, not the average Joe. Thank you.
I'm not mean to have you think that I thought anybody other than an American citizen or a resident of the state in which they were voting had the right to vote.
That's not what you said.
When I said it should be, registration should be open on election day, or registration on demand, it would be for those people who have fulfilled that requirement. It would not be for any Joe off the street. It would not be for any illegal person. It would not be for anyone who would not normally have fulfilled the basic things. The whole idea was to increase the opportunity to register and therefore increase the opportunity for more people to vote. The people who get shunned by the restrictions we currently have are largely people who live in minority neighborhoods. And that would make our country more democratic than it is if the voter participation increased. What do we get on an election year? If we get 55% of the registered voters out, we think we've hit the jackpot. In India, they're going to have over 90% of their people will vote in the current election, which will take them 45 days to conduct, because there are over 900 million people who are going to be voting. My son just came back from India. He gave me all those stats, so they're on the top of my head. All right? I think you and I are on the same page.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
But and I don't want, I'd let somebody else talk, but I just don't know how to express myself. I just think voter registration is important. I agree.
Oh, yeah.
And to vote for a candidate is important. But you must prove who you are. And as far as you're saying that somebody from rural America is not going to come into town to vote, I don't think that's true, because if he's running his tractor and it breaks down, he's going into town to get it fixed. So he can go into town to register to vote as well. That's my opinion.
Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions?
We have other questions. Oh, yeah.
I do agree with this gentleman about making it easier to vote, cheapens the vote. A citizen has the responsibility to avail themselves of voting and making themselves qualified to vote by having ID, registering, and becoming informed candidates. It would be too easy for fraud to occur, which we know it does. It's not always caught, but it does occur. And making it easier for that to happen disenfranchises the citizens. And the Electoral College, now, if that were eliminated, we would no longer be a republic. We would become a democracy and basically be ruled by the two hosts.
Do you think there is any value in starting political education at a younger age, as opposed to, personally, I have not had any education in politics other than history, and I will not have any education in that front until next year, which will be when I turn 18 and am allowed to vote. So do you think there is any value in starting younger?
That I was going to mention is this great new social studies framework that New York State adopted. So unfortunately, you guys who are 11th graders and 12th graders, you didn't experience that. But there's the whole new social studies curriculum. One of the pieces is taking informed action. So I do think that it is starting much sooner, at least in New York State. And so that's one of the things that the word that is hanging out that they're known to say is that we have a federalist system, right? So that's why our founders from the very beginning have been, we're always concerned about looking out for the interests of the states, almost even more than the United States. So that's why we vary with voter registration. That's why we have single-member districts, so that a rep will represent their district. So if you get rid of that, then you're losing that as well. So federalism plays a big part, those of us living in New York State. When it comes to education, though, I think that actually we are headed in the right direction because the new curriculum, I think students are being exposed at a much earlier age, not just to what does the Constitution say, but how do you take informed action? How do you look at different opinions, and how do you problem solve and support your claims with evidence? That's an important part of it as well.
A few people said a few things about how the districts are kind of a little bit unfair. But in some countries like Germany, in their Bundestag, everyone just votes and the party makes a list of people then put in there. But then representatives have no connection to the people really. So is that like a okay sacrifice to kind of make for a more fair system? I don't know, I think it's nice to have kind of a connection, but.
Well, that could be said of the British system as well. Members of Parliament are sort of placed into individual districts regardless of what relationship they have to that. Anybody want
I think that every one of these questions involves trade-offs. I think Winston Churchill was right, and I'm not sure that there is a perfect system. But you're absolutely right. If single-member districts have advantages, they also have disadvantages, and I think we have to know what the trade-offs are when we make these decisions. I think that's what's most important about this. And I agree. Dismantling the Electoral College, it involves trade-offs, and we need to think about what those trade-offs are, and whether we're willing to give up one thing for something else.
Patrick Monroe, Sleepy Hollow. In 1996, General Motors knocked down the last building that they owned on that huge swath of land in Sleepy Hollow. It's one of the biggest opportunities to expand either Tarrytown or Sleepy Hollow in my lifetime, and I've lived here all my life. So my question is, to the high school students who are here, I'm delighted to see you guys, and your teachers, how important is it for students, young people, to be actively involved in planning the development, the extension of the village they live in? Because in 1996, it started. Here we are, 2019, and they're laying roads down there. How involved? Have Hackley students been involved? Have Sleepy Hollow students been involved in talking about how a community ought to develop 88 acres on its waterfront? If you don't involve the young in this, the future belongs not to them.
We did it with our seniors in looking at the comprehensive plan. So they actually did do that, and it was real exciting. We also try to do partnerships with the both village administrators, because they do have a goal, which is to have our young people come back, live in the community. And so, I have a student right now who's interning, with the village administrator in Tarrytown. So we do try to build those partnerships, but they reached out to us, to both villages, in terms of their comprehensive plans in the future. So, and the kids really appreciated that and had some great ideas.
Anyone else? Any other? Yes.
Is it true that the Electoral College were to be done away with? It really only determines the presidential election, correct? So if that were to be the case, and the presidential nominees were forced to focus on more highly densely populated areas, which tend to be a little more progressive, a little bit more, diverse. The subject group, right, tends to represent a little bit better the vast majority of the individuals living in this country, and then allowing for, take away gerrymandering, and you have state residents better able to represent their representatives who will be in the other branches of government. Is that not a decent trade-off, or is it really a concern that rural Americans will never be able to win, their party will never be able to win again, or will it be able to kind of better represent a mix of the people who live in this country?
A lot of that has to do with how much authority you want to give the executive branch of government. If the electoral college were eliminated and you were electing your president and only your president by popular vote, wherever it is, and you have a presidency that is enormously powerful, that can really screw things up. But you do have a Senate that is modeled on more or less the basis that the electoral college was supposed to be, that is representation by states, and you've got a more stable system there where people in Kansas and Wyoming and elsewhere are going to have actually a larger than representation, but that's a balancing factor in that. So, but I think it'd be worthwhile for everybody, particularly the students here, to start thinking about ways in which you would fix that. It's not an easy fix, as I think it's been clear here tonight. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
No.
Do we have any other? Yes.
Citizens United. That's gotta go. There's a quick fix. In South Africa, one person, one vote worked. Nelson Mandela became president. And my third thing is for Chris. Net neutrality has not been a glamorous issue that people get all excited about, but it will and is starting to control the flow of information. The corporate interests will decide who gets to read, see, work, interact with what. They can squash the little guys. For internet startups, it's not a good thing. So can you explain to people?
So this idea of net neutrality, which is basically the idea that we should treat the internet in law much like we have treated historically, for example, like telephone lines, which is to say that the people who bring you the internet should sort of have a, well, they're sort of like traffic cops. They're not kind of giving Maseratis a break over the Ford Fiestas. So this is something that goes way back. I'm not a super fan of the FCC's decisions in my own personal politics. I think just a couple points are worth noting here. Historically, the FCC has not been an especially aggressive or effective regulatory body, so the most recent regulators fit pretty well within that historical tradition. In fact, if you go to the origins of the FCC and even its predecessor, the Federal Radio Commission from the 1920s, most of the guys running the show there had direct connections to the industries they were charged with regulating. And that goes from the commissioners all the way down to the engineers. So this tradition of the FCC being, pardon the expression, in bed with big business is pretty much par for the course, which doesn't make me a super fan of it. But I also would be pretty skeptical of kind of catastrophizing net neutrality in terms of using that as a weapon, or Verizon or Optimum, you kind of weaponizing that to discriminate, say, between like liberal or conservative press sources. I think that could happen, yes, and we should be skeptical and on guard about that. But that's pretty. I see that as being at the extreme of a much longer historical process. So I suppose my answer is I'm not a fan, but I also don't lose a lot of sleep about it, only because, again, this idea of communications technologies sort of being left to private development for better and for worse.
Other questions?
Just have a question. In all the things we've discussed tonight, the panel has shared with us in terms of political structures, the rules and regs and how our government works have been actually pretty enlightening and very valid. But to piggyback on what George said, if I think about our government in Washington, the single biggest problem we have right now is partisanship and party affiliation over love of country. And I think the only way that that's ever going to be fixed is to have term limits. If the presidency of this country is limited to 2 terms, then that should hold true for senator, representative, county executive, town executive, village mayors, everywhere in this land. You get 2 terms to do the best you can. And at the end of that, you go back to your regular job like everybody else, and you make money like everybody else, and give someone else a chance. Because then there'll be more of an incentive for people to get something done quickly in their 2 terms, instead of someone being a state senator for 40 years and worry about their party's agenda rather than what's good for the country.
I just have 2 quick thoughts on that. The first one is historical. So when we think about the sort of greatest turnout for American democracy in our nation's history, it was also, that correlates pretty strongly with periods of intense partisanship. So if we look back to the 19th century, when Democrats are going up against the Whigs, or in the Gilded Age when you have Republicans versus Democrats, you see just rates of voter turnout that would make registrar salivate today. So perhaps one benefit of partisanship is in mobilizing voters to go out and actually participate in politics. The other thing I just want to point out is that I actually happen to be kind of a fan of partisanship, and I think that's because I'm sort of a sap in that I think I support civil discourse. I think when people, when we attack partisanship, it often comes from a place of cynicism. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, sir. It often comes from a place of cynicism, which is to say that there's nothing worth fighting over. And I think it's really worth thinking critically about what it is that's causing that, right? And I happen to think that the team I happen to support is fighting over some real issues, and therefore I actually don't really mind, because I want my team to go out and fight for those things. And that's also incidentally what drives me personally to the polls every election cycle. So that's not to, I just think it's worth seeing the issue sort of in full perspective, that there's other ways of looking at it too.
Well, the discourse is important, but it's an awful big price to pay for advocacy, because nothing gets done. So if there are term limits, you know you have a restricted period of time where the talk is over, we put everybody in a room, and we get something done.
Just want to point out as a history teacher that we tend to, I think, over-romanticize some golden age when congregate politics was free of partisanship. If you look at the campaign statements made by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in the election of 1800, and these are men who were close personal friends for much of their life. The things that they said about one another, the things that their campaigns said about one another, would make the 2 candidates in the 2016 elections hair stand on end. What Adams and Jefferson accused each other of, much of it would be unprintable today. And to think that there is some golden age when everybody just all got along, and the founding fathers were just as vicious as today's politicians. And so I think we need to remember that we've lived through many periods of hyper-partisanship when things actually have gotten done.
I think we're out of time. This has been a really good conversation. I want to thank everybody and the panel members for coming here and having this discussion. There are some refreshments in the room next door, so we can continue conversations there. But Maureen, thank you for everything that the library has done, and it's been a great evening. Thank you.
I would like to say yes.
Well, I